Roman soldier stands at a low market table in the full heat of a Mediterranean afternoon, and a merchant measures out a portion of white salt into his open palm. The crystals are bright. They catch the light the way small chips of ice might, each one edged and precise, and the weight of them is real and familiar in the way that anything worth having usually is. The soldier closes his fingers. The salt is part of what he is owed. It is part of his pay, measured and handed over like any other wage, and he carries it away from the stall with the same unremarkable confidence of a man collecting what belongs to him. That portion of salt had a name. The Romans called it the asterisk salarium asterisk, the salt portion, the salt allowance, the measured amount of salt that formed part of a soldier's official compensation in the Roman military. And from asterisk salarium asterisk, shaped over centuries of use and erosion, spoken through the mouths of traders and clerks and landowners across a dozen different regions and languages, worn down by time the way a stone is worn down by water moving steadily over it, came the word that sits in an ordinary mouth today, salary. The word is used every day. It moves through offices and conversations without weight, without ceremony, without any sense of what it was before it was a word. A salary is a number. A salary is a figure agreed upon. But before it was any of those things, it was salt, white, physical, valuable enough to argue over and carefully measure, and the soldier closing his hand around his portion was in a sense holding the word in its original form. Salt was not a convenience in the ancient world. It was a necessity. Before refrigeration, before industrial preservation, before any of the methods that now stand between food and spoilage, salt was one of the only reliable means of keeping meat and fish edible across the distances and time spans that a military campaign required. To control salt was to control something genuinely important. To receive salt was to receive something genuinely useful. To receive salt was to receive something genuinely useful. The asterisk salarium asterisk was not a symbolic payment or a ceremonial one. It was practical to the point of being almost blunt. Here is a substance you require to live and to function, and you have earned it. What happens to a word after centuries of use is something like what happens to a path after centuries of feet. The original purpose, the clearing of undergrowth, the getting from one place to another, persists somewhere underneath, but the path itself becomes something else. It becomes worn smooth. It becomes the route people use, not because they chose it, but because it is simply there, already made, already obvious. The word asterisk salary asterisk has been walked across so many times that the salt underneath it is barely visible. A person could use the word 10,000 times and never once think of a soldier standing at a market table in the afternoon sun, never once think of crystals bright in a palm, never once connect the number on a pay slip to the taste of the sea. But the connection is there. It does not require believing in it to remain true. Language preserves things the way amber preserves things, not with intention, not with ceremony, but simply by the slow accretion of matter around a moment until the moment is held inside something solid. The soldier's salt is inside the word. It has been inside the word for more than 2,000 years, and nothing that has happened in those 2,000 years has dissolved it. It is simply waiting to be noticed, the way most things that have been there all along are waiting to be noticed. The word asterisk, disaster, asterisk carries something just as old inside it, though the thing it carries is not a substance but a belief. The Italian word asterisk desiderates is where the modern English version arrived from, and asterisk dissets Asterisk itself is constructed from two Latin parts, asterisk dis asterisk, which meant something like bad, unfavorable, or against, and asterisk astro, asterisk, which came from the Latin for star. A disaster, in the word's original understanding, was not merely a terrible event. It was an event caused by the wrong position of a celestial body. It was catastrophe with an astronomical origin. For a very long time in the ancient world, this was not metaphor. It was not a poetic way of attributing misfortune to fate or to forces beyond human control. The relationship between the positions of stars and the outcomes of human lives was understood by a great many careful and educated people as a working mechanism, as real and as traceable as the relationship between rain and a flooded river. When something went terribly wrong, the first question was not always what happened, but where the stars were when it happened. The second question was what the position of those stars might mean. Two figures on an ancient Mediterranean hillside on a clear night, pointing upward at a cluster near the southern horizon, speaking in low voices about the position of what they are looking at. The conversation has a kind of gravity to it that is not dramatic. It is the gravity of two people consulting a tool they believe in, the way a modern person might consult a weather report or a map. The stars were not merely beautiful. They were not merely vast. They were legible to people who had learned to read them in a way that made the difference between a good decision and a ruinous one. To sail on a day with a bad star configuration was not reckless by attitude. It was reckless by evidence, as the people making those decisions understood evidence. When something bad happened, despite all the precautions, when the storm arrived, or the campaign failed, or the harvest rotted, the stars were examined for an explanation. And the explanation that was found, the cluster near the horizon, the planet in the wrong house, the star that should not have been where it was, gave the catastrophe its name. It was a bad star event. A asterisk disaster asterisk. The belief that generated the word has mostly receded. The word remains. It has been detached from its astronomical foundation, the way a boat can be detached from its mooring, and will continue to float perfectly well without any connection to where it was fastened. But the mooring was there. The night sky over the ancient Mediterranean was genuinely part of the word asterisk disaster asterisk. Every time it is used for a fire, for a flood, for a failed plan, for anything that goes comprehensively and irrecoverably wrong, the stars are there inside it, waiting in the background, silent and old and no longer consulted. The word sits quietly in its modern use, doing its job, stripped of its cosmological scaffolding. The scaffolding was real once. The men and women who built it were not credulous in any simple sense. They were working with what they had, in the careful way that people working with limited information often do, drawing lines between the things they could observe and the things they could not fully explain. That the lines they drew were wrong does not diminish the care that went into drawing them. It only means that what got preserved inside the word is a very old attempt to find order in the worst moments. There is a word in ordinary use for the muscle under the skin of the forearm, a word for the tissue that moves when a hand closes, a word that has been spoken by doctors and athletes and people discussing minor injuries without any particular sense of what it contains. The Latin word is asterisk musculus, asterisk. It is the diminutive of asterisk mus asterisk, which is the Latin word for mouse, of asterisk musculus. Asterisk was a little mouse. The Roman physicians and scholars who arrived at this comparison were not being careless. They were being descriptive in the most precise way available to them, which was the way of close observation. A physician pressing two fingers against the inside of a patient's forearm and watching what happens when the patient's hand closes, watching the shape that rises briefly beneath the skin, the way it moves quickly and then settles, the way it produces a small, rounded traveling motion just under the surface, saw something that looked to the people making the comparison like a small animal moving beneath a thin piece of cloth, like a mouse, like something alive and rapid and tucked just under what covers it. The image is, once it is presented, not a difficult one to follow. The moving muscle is quick in the way that a small animal is quick. The shape it makes is rounded and brief. The skin it moves beneath is pale and smooth, the way linen is pale and smooth. A Roman physician who had observed both things, mice moving, muscles moving, and reached for the word that best described the similarity, was doing the thing that all naming does at its origin, finding the closest available comparison and committing to it. The comparison committed itself to the word committed itself to every language that borrowed it. And now, in the word asterisk muscle asterisk, a small Roman mouse runs permanently beneath the surface, invisible but present, moving whenever the arm moves. This is what words do. They preserve the moment of naming. They carry the original act of perception. Someone looking at something for what may have been the first time and reaching for the image that made it legible. And they hold that act inside them long after the person who performed it is gone. The Roman physician who first called the moving tissue under the skin a little mouse has no name now. The patient whose forearm was being examined has no name. But the comparison they were part of is still running, still small and quick, still tucked inside a word used every day by people who have no idea it is there. Pan was a god of wild places. He belonged to the rocky hillsides and the dense pine forests and the high mountain passes and the isolated valleys, to all the landscapes where human settlement thinned out and the sounds of the human world gave way to other sounds. He was the patron of flocks and shepherds, the god who was present in the remote places that a traveler might have to cross when moving from one inhabited place to another. He was part of the ancient Greek landscape in a way that was not purely conceptual. Pan was believed to be genuinely present in remote places, in the way that a person is genuinely present in a room. The god was there. The solitude was his. There is a particular experience of the ancient world that has a specific name in Greek, asterisk, panikon, daima, asterisk, the panic terror, the terror of Pan. This was not a general anxiety or a vague unease. It was a specific phenomenon, the sudden, irrational, overwhelming fear that could overtake a traveler in a remote place for no visible cause. The forest, the hillside, the empty mountain pass, a moment of inexplicable cold moving through the body, a certainty that something was near, a fear that seemed to arrive from nowhere and carry no information about its source. An ancient Greek traveler moving alone through dense pine trees at midday, not at night, not in a storm, not in any circumstances that would seem to justify alarm, stopping suddenly in the middle of the path because something has happened that cannot be explained. The trees are the same, the light is the same, the path ahead is clear, and yet the body has decided, completely without permission, that it is afraid. The heart quickens, the hands become uncertain. The desire to run arrives before any reason for running has presented itself. The Greeks named this experience after the god who was believed to cause it. To walk through Pan's landscape was to be subject to what Pan might do, and what Pan might do, apparently, was reach into a traveler without warning and place fear there, the way a hand might be placed on a shoulder in the dark. The word for the experience was asterisk panikon. Asterisk. The experience traveled the way experiences do, into the vocabulary of people who described it, and then into the vocabulary of people who learned the word without necessarily knowing the theology behind it. And eventually, the word settled, stripped of its divine origin, but intact in its meaning, into asterisk, panic, asterisk. The word asterisk, panic, asterisk is now used for an alarm going off, for a moment of misplaced keys before an important meeting, for traffic on a highway when an exit has been missed. It is used with no reference to remote hillsides, no reference to pine forests at noon, no reference to an ancient Greek god whose presence in the landscape was once the explanation for the most frightening kind of irrational fear a traveler could experience. But Pan is inside the word. His name is the word. The asterisk panic, asterisk in a crowded office or a delayed train carries the ancient Greek hillside inside it, the wild landscape, the god of isolated places, reaching into the chest of a traveler for no reason that could be explained. There is something gentle about this, viewed from the right distance. The gods of the ancient world did not disappear when the belief in them faded. They did not go silently. They went into the language. They became the words that describe the things they were once believed to cause, and in that form they have persisted, not powerful, not worshipped, not feared, but present. Pan lives inside asterisk panic, asterisk. He is there every time the word is used, small and ancient, and no longer dangerous, the way an old worry becomes an old memory, becomes something you can hold in the hand and look at without feeling anything except a mild recognition. A cold gray morning on the coast of Scandinavia, or along the shores of northern Britain, or in any of the places where people who spoke Old Norse went about the business of living in the world. A building with walls, a wall with an opening cut into it. Through the opening, the wind comes in. This is the function of the opening, not to provide a view, not to let in light, not to frame a landscape, but to allow the movement of air through a structure that would otherwise be sealed and still. The opening is defined by what it lets through. What it lets through is wind. The Old Norse word for such an opening in a wall was asterisk vindauga. Asterisk, it is a compound word built from two simpler ones, asterisk vinder, asterisk meaning wind, and asterisk auga, asterisk meaning eye, a wind eye. The name describes the gap as an opening through which wind could move, phrased in a way that gives the wall a kind of face, a feature that looks outward, that connects the inside of a structure to everything outside it. Whether the naming was poetic in intention or simply practical, an efficient description of what the opening did is not something that can be recovered now. But the word itself has a quality of attention to it, as though whoever first used it had stopped and considered what was most true about the thing, and then named the truth. This word entered Middle English through the contact between Norse-speaking settlers and the people they lived among, traded with, and eventually merged with across several centuries in northern and eastern Britain. Languages borrow the words that they find useful, and asterisk vindolga asterisk was apparently more useful than whatever had been used before, useful enough, or simply prevalent enough, that it took hold and gradually became the ordinary word for the thing. Over time, the sound of it shifted. The Norse syllables softened and contracted in English mouths, the way borrowed words often do when they are passed through enough generations of speakers for whom the original sound is not native. Asterisk vindoga, asterisk became asterisk window, asterisk. Every window in every building in the English-speaking world is named after the Old Norse concept of a wind eye. Every hotel room and hospital corridor and kitchen above a garden sink, and railway carriage and office, where a person sits at a desk looking out at a street. Every one of those openings carries the word that a Norse speaker used for the cold wind that came through the gap in the wall. The wind that comes through a window is the same wind that was inside the word from the beginning. It has been there all along, pressing through the opening, moving through the room, the wind that the name was built around, still doing exactly what the name always said it did. What the word asterisk, Vindauga asterisk, preserved is a way of seeing. It preserved the understanding of a gap in a wall as something defined by what passes through it, not by the frame, not by the glass that would eventually be fitted into it, not by the view it provides or the light it admits, but by the wind. The wall has an eye. The eye looks outward. Through it, the outside world presses inward in the most literal sense, as moving air, as temperature, as the presence of the landscape beyond the wall, making itself felt inside the room. Glass came later, the frame came later, the curtain came later, and the sill and the latch and all the modifications that turned a rough opening in a Norse longhouse wall into the fitted, sealed, architecturally considered window of the present. But underneath all of that modification, the wind eye is still there. The compound still holds. The first description, the most direct one, the one that named what the opening actually did, is preserved inside the word the same way the salt is preserved inside asterisk salary, asterisks, the same way the stars are preserved inside asterisks, disaster, asterisks, the same way the mouse runs beneath the surface of asterisk muscle, asterisks, the same way the god stands inside asterisks, panic, asterisks. These are ordinary words. They are used without ceremony, without reference to their origins, without any sense of the history they carry. A person asking for a raise is not thinking about a Roman soldier at a salt market. A person describing something that has gone wrong is not thinking about ancient astronomers consulting the positions of celestial bodies for meaning. A person mentioning a muscle or a window or a moment of irrational fear has no particular reason to think about Roman physicians or Norse longhouses or the Greek god who lived in remote mountain landscapes. The words work perfectly well without any of that knowledge. They have always worked without it, but the knowledge is there. The history is inside the words, in the same way that the grain of a tree is inside the wood, not visible on the surface, not necessary to understand that the wood is solid and can hold weight, but present throughout, running through every inch of what the word has become. The Roman soldier is in every salary. The stars are in every disaster. The little mouse runs in every muscle. The god stands behind every panic. The wind moves through every window. The ordinary English language is full of this, full of old preserved moments, old comparisons, old beliefs, old names for things that have since been explained differently, or named again, or forgotten entirely, and yet the words persist. They persist the way words do, which is to say, stubbornly, imperviously, with no particular interest in whether the things they originally referred to still exist. Asterisk, salary. Asterisk does not require salt to mean salary. Asterisk, disaster. Asterisk does not require a belief in stellar causation to mean catastrophe. The words have outrun their origins and continue to be used with perfect confidence by people who have no idea what they are carrying. This is not a reason for alarm. It is not a problem that requires solving. It is simply one of the quieter facts about ordinary language, that it carries more than it appears to, that the words used in the most routine conversations have been traveling for centuries before arriving in a particular mouth on a particular morning, and that somewhere inside each of them, if followed far enough back, There is a specific moment of naming, someone looking at something and reaching for the best word they had, pressing the image into the sound and sending it forward. The sound travels, the image stays inside it. The moment of naming persists in the word, the way the shape of a hand persists in the clay it pressed. Someone pressed the clay hardened, the shape remained. A longhouse wall in the north of Europe, on a gray morning, the wind is steady. It finds the opening in the wall and moves through it, spreading into the dim interior of the building, carrying the cold of the outside in with it. The opening was made for this purpose, not to be sealed against the wind, but to allow it, to give the wind a passage and a direction, to let the air of the outside world move into the space where people sleep and work and keep warm. The person who first called this opening a Maeterich, Vindauga asterisk, a wind eye, was describing a gap that looked outward and let the world through. The wind was the word's whole reason. The eye was the wall's face turned toward what was moving. Every word for a window in every language that borrowed the Norse term carries this in it. The opening is not merely structural, it is, in the word's original understanding, a kind of sense organ, a place in the wall where the wind comes in and the wall becomes briefly something alive. The language looked at the gap and saw a face. The face looked out. Through it, the wind has been moving ever since. That is where the word rests on a gray morning in a cold room, with the wind pressing steadily through an opening in the wall, a word built from two simpler words that together say exactly what the thing does, wind and eye. The wind's eye, an opening in a wall that lets the world look in and lets the inside look out, and through it, the air of everything beyond the wall is always moving, always present, always doing exactly what the name said it would do. The word asterisk Vindauga, asterisk became asterisk window, asterisk, the window kept the wind. The wind kept moving through it, through every building that ever had one, through every word that ever named the opening, through the long centuries between the Norse longhouse and the present, in which the glass and the frame and the latch have been added, but the word itself has remained what it always was, a passage for what moves, a gap in what is solid, an eye turned outward into the open air. In a counting house in medieval Andalusia, by the low warm light of an oil lamp, an Arabic-speaking merchant reaches into a bale of white fiber and draws out a handful of the raw material his ledger describes as asterisk, quitten, asterisk. The fiber is soft in a specific way, resistant and fine at once, neither wool's crimp nor linen's stiffness, something of its own character entirely. He sets it on a small brass scale. The pan tips. He adjusts the counterweight with practiced patience, and the beam finds its level in the lamplight, and the word he uses for what he is measuring will begin, from this room, a long westward journey through ports and languages and centuries that he cannot see from where he stands, and it will arrive, eventually, changed almost beyond recognition, as a word so ordinary that the people using it will never pause to wonder where it came from. Cotton. The fiber itself stayed the same, only its name kept traveling. English is not a language that grew in one place from one root. It is, instead, a net that was thrown over many places at many different times, and what it caught, it kept. The words sitting in an ordinary mouth on an ordinary morning, words for common foods, for daily actions, for the sky overhead, arrived there from Arabic counting houses, from the warm rooms of colonial India, from Aztec market stalls, from Norse settlements in the English north, from French banquet tables in newly conquered English manors. The borrowing was rarely deliberate. It happened the way things always happen, When people who speak different languages live close to one another long enough, the words that fill a practical need travel the path of least resistance into the mouths of whoever needs them and stay. The Arabic word asterisk quetin, asterisk, made its first major westward move through the trading ports of the Iberian Peninsula, where Arabic-speaking merchants had established a sophisticated commercial presence over many centuries. The Spanish merchants learned the fiber's name from the people who sold it to them, and the word shifted slightly in their mouths, algodón in Spanish, though the root of the Arabic was still audible underneath. From Spanish and Italian trading networks, the fiber traveled into French, and from French into English, the word condensing and simplifying along the way, until only the hard central syllable remained, polished down by use into something short and unremarkable. Cotton, a word that feels entirely English now, a word that carries, in its compressed form, the memory of a merchant's hand on a brass scale in lamplight, the fiber soft against his palm, in a city whose name was itself a wonder of layered history. The Arabic language contributed more to English than the name of a fiber. Al-Khwarizmi was a 9th century mathematician working in Baghdad, a scholar whose full name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and the book he wrote on the solving of mathematical equations contained a term in its title that would travel farther than he could have anticipated. The term was asterisk al-jabr, asterisk, the reunion of broken parts, the restoration of something separated. It referred to a specific mathematical operation, the process of moving a subtracted quantity from one side of an equation to the other to restore balance. Al-Khwarizmi used the word in a technical and precise way, rooted in the Arabic meaning of setting a broken bone, of reduction and completion. A Spanish translation of his work brought asterisk al-jabr asterisk into Latin letters. From Latin, it moved into the scholarly vocabulary of medieval Europe. The term contracted and hardened through repeated use until it became asterisk algebra. Asterisk, the word now printed at the top of textbook chapters and spoken in classrooms without any trace of its origin in a 9th century description of mathematical restoration. The operation it originally described, moving a term across an equation to balance it, is still performed by students every day in the same motion Al-Khwarizmi described, using a word that is still under its European surface, his. In a candlelit room in Toledo, in the 12th century, a scholar bends over a newly translated Arabic manuscript and works carefully at transferring the mathematical symbols into Latin letters. The process is slow. There are concepts in the Arabic text for which Latin has no ready vocabulary, and the scholar must decide, in each case, whether to translate the meaning or preserve the sound of the original term. When he reaches asterisk al-jabr asterisk, he preserves the sound. He writes the Arabic term into his Latin manuscript, slightly adjusted for Latin phonology, and in doing so he makes a decision that will persist for nearly 1,000 years. The room around him is quiet. The lamp burns steadily. Outside, the city conducts its ordinary nighttime business in several languages at once, Arabic and Castilian, and the Latin of the church and the Hebrew of the merchants, all of them exchanging words at the market stalls and the doorways, the way traders exchange goods, some words lasting, some words not, the useful ones surviving because they are used, the obsolete ones falling away because they are not needed anymore. Al-Khwarizmi's name also traveled, though it traveled differently. The Latin translators of his works rendered his name as asterisk, algorithmi, asterisk, and from that Latinized version came the word asterisk algorithm asterisk. Now one of the central words of modern computing and mathematics, naming the structured sequences of instructions by which complex operations are carried out. A medieval scholar's name, copied into a manuscript by lamplight in a Spanish city, now appears on screens and in technical documents across the world, so thoroughly abstracted from its origin that it reads as a technical term rather than a proper name. The man and the word have, at this distance, almost entirely separated. What remains of him is the shape of his thinking, turned into a noun. The word asterisk kahwa, asterisk, followed a different route. In Arabic, it referred to a beverage, specifically a dark, bitter, stimulating drink brewed from roasted seeds that had been cultivated in the highland regions of East Africa and then more deliberately grown across Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. Asterisk kawawa. Asterisk described the drink in a general sense, and possibly also a kind of wine, and the root carried associations with something that reduces appetite or dulls hunger, an etymology that suits the beverage, which does both. The word entered Turkish as asterisk kafwe, asterisk, and it was through Ottoman Turkish trade networks that the drink began to move westward. Italian merchants encountered it at Ottoman ports and brought both the beverage and its name back to Italy, where asterisk kafwe, asterisk became café. From Italian, the word spread into French as café and into English as asterisk coffee asterisk. The beverage itself, arriving in European cities during the 16th and 17th centuries, and establishing the coffee house as a new kind of social institution, where news and argument circulated alongside the drink. The word made the same journey as the substance, from the Arabic-speaking world through Ottoman trade to Italian ports to the rest of Europe, and it arrived trailing almost nothing of its origin except the sound of its first syllable, which has remained consistent across every language it passed through, as though the word itself remembered where it started, even as everything around it changed. The borrowing from Arabic into English was never a single event. It happened across centuries and through intermediaries, Spanish and Italian and French, each serving at different times as the channel through which Arabic words passed into Northern European languages. The scholars of medieval Europe depended on Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts that had been lost in the Latin West, and in reading those translations, they absorbed not only the ideas but the vocabulary that had grown around them. Asterisk algebra, algorithm, coffee, cotton, asterisk, each one a word that entered English already, old, already worn into its shape by use in other mouths and other scripts, arriving with a history that English speakers were mostly unaware of, and mostly did not need to be aware of, since the words worked perfectly well without it. The word asterisk shampoo, asterisk, arrived in English by a different kind of root entirely. During the period when British administrators and traders were establishing a sustained presence in India, they encountered a practice that had no direct equivalent in European daily life, a form of head massage performed with heated oils in which the scalp and shoulders were worked with firm pressing and kneading motions. The Hindi word for this action was champo, the imperative form of a verb, meaning to press or knead, and it was an instruction rather than a noun, something more like a command than a label. British travelers and administrators adopted the word for the practice itself, carrying it back to England where it became asterisk champo. Asterisk and then asterisk shampoo, asterisk initially describing the whole experience of the oil massage. It was only later, as the practice of washing the hair became more formalized and separated from the massage context, that the word narrowed in meaning. By the 19th century, asterisk shampoo, asterisk referred specifically to the act of washing the hair rather than the broader physical ritual it had once named. The pressing and kneading of the original action survived in the word, even after the action it described had shifted into something gentler and more domestic, and the Hindi imperative, the instruction to press, became a noun in English describing a product sold in bottles on bathroom shelves. The pressing motion forgotten, the word remaining. There is something worth sitting with in that kind of narrowing. Words that begin as verbs, as actions, as instructions, sometimes travel into languages where they become objects, or categories, or products. The action champak became the noun asterisk shampoo, asterisk. The specific technique became a general category. The warm, oiled scalp became the cold plastic bottle. What the word retained, across all of that transformation, was only its sound. The meaning rebuilt itself around the sound in its new home, fitting whatever the new context required. This is how borrowed words settle, not all at once, not through any single deliberate act, but gradually, over years of use, until the word fits so naturally into its adopted language that the original form becomes genuinely difficult to hear inside it. An attendant in a warm room in 18th century India works oil into a British administrator's scalp with practiced steady pressure. The room is close and quiet. The oil is warm. The motion is rhythmic, the kind of repetitive physical action that produces a specific quality of attention, absorbed and directionless at once. The Hindi word for what is being done hangs in the room alongside the smell of the oil and the sound of the city outside, a word that belongs to this specific action in this specific place, ordinary and unremarkable to everyone present. It will be heard carried westward across several thousand miles of ocean, changed slightly in each mouth that uses it, and will eventually describe a product entirely different from this moment. The oil gone, the pressing gone, the warm room gone, the word remaining attached to something new it never originally named. The path from the Americas into English is perhaps the most compressed of all the linguistic journeys in this account, because it happened over a relatively short period beginning in the 16th century, after European contact with the civilizations of the New World introduced the people of Europe to crops and foods and substances they had no words for because they had never encountered the things themselves. The Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztec civilization of central Mexico contributed a cluster of words to Spanish, and then through Spanish to English, and among the most widely traveled of those words are three that appear on modern kitchen tables with a frequency that makes them feel entirely native to the language that uses them: chocolate, tomato, avocado, each one a Nahuatl word, each one slightly adjusted by Spanish, each one now embedded in English as though it had always been there. The Nahuatl word socolat described a bitter, frothy drink prepared from cacao seeds, beaten until the liquid foamed, sometimes mixed with spices or other flavorings. The first part of the compound word carried the sense of bitterness or sourness. The second part, asterisk at asterisk meant water, a bitter water. The drink was thick and dark, and not sweet in the way European palates would later insist on making it, and the Spanish who first encountered it in the courts and markets of the Aztec world carried both a version of the drink and its name back to Europe, where the name contracted and softened, asterisk chocolate asterisk, and the drink itself was sweetened with sugar and gradually transformed into something closer to what the word now conjures in the European imagination. The bitterness in the original name is still there if it is looked for. The asterisk chocolate, asterisk of chocolat, carried the flavor of the thing it named. What arrived in English was a word that had been sweetened at the same time as the substance it described. A Spanish priest in 16th century Mexico watches an Aztec merchant work at a preparation table, pouring a dark liquid from one clay vessel into another in a thin stream, the liquid foaming as it meets the air. The priest has never seen this before. He does not know the word for what he is looking at. He hears it spoken by the people around the table, sokolatur, and he stores the sound carefully because he will need a word for this when he writes about it, and no word in his own language covers exactly what he is seeing. He will use the Nahuatl word adjusted for Spanish phonology because it is the only word available that names what is in the vessel. This is how a word crosses a language boundary, not through any formal decision, but through the simple necessity of naming something that has arrived in the world without a name in the language of the person who encounters it. The word asterisk, tomatel, asterisk, named a round, acidic fruit with a smooth skin, cultivated and used extensively in Aztec cooking in ways that the Spanish had not previously encountered. The Spanish adopted both the fruit and a version of the word asterisk tomate, asterisk, and carried them back to Europe, where the fruit was regarded with some initial suspicion before becoming a staple of the cuisines of southern Europe, and eventually a word so familiar in English that its Nahuatl origin requires a moment of deliberate attention to register. Tomato. The asterisk, tela asterisk suffix of the original Nahuatl has disappeared. The vowels have shifted. The word has been through Spanish and is now in English, and it names a fruit that appears in so many dishes across so many cultures that it is impossible to imagine modern cooking without it. Though European cooking got along without it entirely for most of its history. The third of the Nahuatl words in this cluster has perhaps the most unexpected origin story. Aguacatclet, named the smooth, fatty fruit of a tree native to central Mexico, but the word itself was also the Nahuatl term for a part of the male anatomy, the testicle, and the fruit was named for its shape, the way it hung in pairs from the tree. The Spanish borrowed the word, they adjusted it to asterisk, aguacate asterisk. In some regions, an asterisk avocado, asterisk in others, the latter influenced by the Spanish word asterisk, abogado, asterisk, meaning lawyer, which sounds similar enough that the two words blurred in European usage, and the fruit traveled into English markets and kitchens carrying this buried etymology that most people who slice one for their breakfast have no occasion to know. The fruit retained its name. The anatomical origin of that name receded entirely from view. What remained was a word that sounds vaguely Spanish and slightly exotic, and that now appears on toast in cafes far from Mexico, the Nahuatl, meaning preserved only in the shape of the fruit on its branch, which has not changed. There is a particular quality to the moment when a new thing arrives and demands a new name. The fruit is on the table, the drink is in the cup, the fiber is in the merchant's hand. The people encountering these things have languages that have served them well for everything they have needed to name so far, but this thing on the table is new, and the name that already exists for it, in the language of the people who cultivated it, is right there, available, practical. The borrowed word is not a sign of inadequacy, it is a sign of contact. A word traveling between languages carries, in its sound, the trace of an encounter between two worlds, and sometimes that is all the history left of the encounter. The word itself, worn smooth, the original context gone, the sound persisting. The Norse-speaking settlers who moved through Britain and established themselves across the north and east of England between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries did not think of themselves as contributing to the English language. They thought of themselves as farming and trading and building and going about the ordinary work of life in a place that suited them. The linguistic contribution happened as a consequence of daily contact between people who spoke related but distinct Germanic languages, Old English and Old Norse, and who needed to communicate with one another across that difference. Some Old Norse words replaced their Old English equivalents entirely. Some filled gaps, some blurred into Old English forms until neither origin was clearly visible. The words that survived this process are among the most common in modern English, so common that they are nearly invisible, which is perhaps the most complete form of absorption a borrowed word can achieve. Sky. The Old English word for the visible atmosphere above the earth was something closer to asterisk welkin, asterisk, a word that survives in English only in poetry and archaic contexts. The Norse word for cloud, ski, came to refer to the sky itself in English, replacing the older term so thoroughly that the Old English word is now the obscure one, the one that requires a footnote, while the Norse word is the one every English speaker reaches for without thinking. Egg. The Old Norse asterisk, egg, asterisk, displaced the Old English egg, which was similar in meaning, but different enough in sound that for a period both forms existed side by side, the Norse version gradually winning the competition for daily use. Knife. The Norse asterisk niffer asterisk became the English asterisk knife asterisk, a word for a tool so basic that it is difficult to imagine daily life without the word any more than without the object itself. A Norse settlement in northern England in the 10th century goes about its mourning in a language that will not be spoken exactly this way in a few generations' time. The inhabitants crack open eggs for their breakfast. The word they use for the egg is the word that will survive. They sharpen their knives at the whetstone. The word they use for the knife is the word that will survive. They step outside and look up at the sky. The word they use for what they see above them is the word that will survive. They cannot know this. The settlement is simply a settlement. The mourning is simply a mourning. The words are simply words, practical and unremarkable in daily use. The survival of a word is determined by use, and use is determined by need, and the need for words for eggs and knives and the sky is perpetual, and so the words that serve that need best tend to persist. And the Norse words for these things persisted so thoroughly that the Old English equivalents faded from use, leaving the Norse words in place as though they had always been there. Even more deeply embedded than any of these content words is the Norse contribution to the pronoun system. The pronouns asterisk, they, asterisk, asterisk them, asterisk, and asterisk, the third-person plural forms, used countless times in every conversation in English, are not native to Old English at all. They derive from the Old Norse forms there, theme, and thera, and they replaced the Old English third-person plural pronouns that preceded them. This is unusual in the history of language. Pronouns are among the most stable elements of any language. They are so central to grammar, so embedded in the structure of expression, that they rarely travel between languages. The fact that the English pronoun system absorbed Norse forms in this particular set suggests how deeply integrated the Norse-speaking population became in the daily life of northern England during this period. Their words not just adopted as labels for new things, and while integrated into the grammatical structure of the language itself, the architecture of English thought, built partly from forms that arrived with a Scandinavian ship. The Norman conquest of 1066 produced a different kind of linguistic layering. When the French-speaking Norman ruling class established itself across England following the conquest, it created a situation in which two languages occupied the same landscape at different social altitudes for several generations. The Normans spoke French at court, in the church, in the halls of the new manors. The Anglo-Saxon population spoke Old English in the fields, in the market, in the ordinary transactions of daily life. The two languages did not merge immediately or cleanly. They existed alongside one another, each associated with a different social position, and the traces of that division are still legible in English vocabulary today, most clearly in the words for animals and for meat. The Anglo-Saxon farmers who kept the animals used their own words for them. A cow was a asterisk, Q asterisk in Old English. A pig was a asterisk, pig asterisk. A sheep was a asterisk, skeep asterisk. These were the words of the people who fed and watered the animals, who knew them by sight, who managed them through the seasons. When the animal was prepared and served at the table, which was to say, when it passed from the domain of the farmer into the domain of the Lord, it passed also from Old English into French. The Norman lord at his banquet table did not eat cow, he ate asterisk boeuf, asterisk, which became asterisk beef, asterisk in English. He did not eat pig, he ate asterisk pork, asterisk, which became asterisk pork, asterisk. He did not eat sheep, he ate asterisk mouton, asterisk, which became asterisk mutton, asterisk. The animals themselves kept their Old English names, the meat they became acquired French ones. This linguistic division reflects a social reality so clearly that it became one of the classic examples in the history of the English language. The living animal, named in the language of the people who tended it, the meat, named in the language of the people who consumed it, both sets of words preserved in modern English as evidence of a division that lasted long enough to fossilize in the vocabulary. A Norman lord seated at a long table in a newly held English manor moves through a meal in French, surrounded by the vocabulary of his own culture, the words for the food, the words for the occasion, the words for the courtly business that fills the evening. The room is lit warmly. The fire burns. The table is long. Outside, beyond the walls, the Anglo-Saxon farmer who tended the cow that is now on the platter moves through the yard in the cold, using different words for the same animal. The same animal, in its living form still named in his language, while its consumed form belongs to someone else's. Both languages are present in this moment. They are not in conversation. They are simply coexisting in the same landscape, the same cold English air, carrying both sets of words at once, neither canceling the other out, both settling eventually into the language that absorbed them. This persistence of both sets of words is one of the reasons modern English has so many synonyms, pairs and triplets of words that cover roughly the same ground, one derived from Old English and one from French, with slightly different registers. Ask and inquire, start and commence, help and assist. The Old English word tends to be shorter, earthier, more immediate in feeling. The French word tends to feel slightly more formal, slightly more distanced, more suited to official contexts. This is not a rule, and there are exceptions, but the pattern is consistent enough to be felt without being consciously analyzed, and it runs through English so deeply that it shapes the texture of the language itself, the sense that there is always a plainer way to say something and a more elevated way, a choice embedded in the vocabulary that reflects a social structure that dissolved long ago. The word asterisk beef. Asterisk carried its French shape into English and kept it. The word asterisk cow. Asterisk kept its Old English shape and kept it too. Both words are in ordinary use. They describe the same animal at different moments in its existence, from different positions in relation to it. This is language absorbing history without commentary, without judgment, simply holding the record of what happened in the shape of the words that outlasted it. The conquest is long over. The linguistic division it created has softened. The words remain, carrying in their different origins the memory of a social arrangement that has no direct equivalent in modern life, but that shaped the vocabulary of everyday English so thoroughly that no amount of time has removed it. The journey from asterisk quatnisterisk to cotton, from asterisk algebra asterisk to algebra, from asterisk quahua asterisk to coffee, from shampoo to shampoo, from chocolat to chocolate, each of these is a story of a word finding its way from one language to another by the most ordinary of routes. Trade, contact, necessity. The practical need to name something that has arrived in the world without a name in the available language. The words did not travel because anyone decided they should. They traveled because the people who used them were in proximity to other people who needed them, and language moves the way water moves, through the available channels, by the path of least resistance, pooling where it finds a place to settle. An ordinary morning in a language is built from hundreds of these journeys. The sky above, a Norse word; the egg at breakfast, Norse; the coffee in the cup, Arabic; through Ottoman Turkish, through Italian, through French; the cotton of the cloth on the table, Arabic, through Spanish trading ports; the chocolate, if there is chocolate, nahuatl, through Spanish, through French; the beef or mutton at the midday meal, French, through the Norman conquest, through several generations of a social division that left its shape in the vocabulary; the shampoo in the bathroom, Hindi, through the colonial period, through a narrowing of meaning that transformed an action into a product. A person who speaks English for a full day without stopping uses words from dozens of languages in the course of the most ordinary transactions, and would not, in the ordinary course of things, need to know this at all. The words work perfectly well without their histories. The histories are simply there, quiet and complete, underneath the words, in the way that the ground is there underneath a field, not visible from above, but present all the way down. An Anglo-Saxon farmer watches his pig root in the cold mud of a yard outside a Norman manor house. The farmer's word for the animal is his own, old, plain, practical, the word his father used, and his father's father. Inside the house, at the long table, the Lord uses a different word for what the pig will become. Both words are true. Both words name the same animal and the same meat, from different positions in relation to it, in different languages, carrying different histories. The cold English air holds both words at once, the French word warm in the firelit hall, and the Old English word cold in the yard, the pig between them, indifferent to either, rooting steadily in the mud, alive in a language that has not yet been asked to translate it. Both words will survive. Both will settle into the same language over the following centuries, that language slowly becoming the one called English, wide enough in the end to hold them both without needing to choose between them. The pig still pig asterisk in the yard, and still something else entirely on the table, both names persisting side by side in the same cold air. The stars were out over an ancient Greek city on a clear, still night. Low on the northern horizon, a cluster of 7 bright points arranged themselves into a shape that Greek astronomers had long since named for a bear, Ursa Major, the great she-bear, wheeling slowly on its fixed point in the dark. A man standing in an open courtyard tilted his head back and located it without difficulty. It was where it always was. He called it asterisk, Arcticos, asterisk of the bear, belonging to the bear, and in that naming he pressed a small piece of the night sky into language where it would stay for a very long time. He did not know, and could not have known, that far below the curve of the earth, in a direction he had no concept of, there was a landmass larger than any he had ever considered. He had no knowledge of its existence, neither did anyone else in his city or his century. The word asterisk, Arcticos. Asterisk meant the north. It meant the place of the bare stars. It meant home, orientation, the fixed point that sailors used to find their way across dark water. It meant all of those things, and it meant nothing at all about what lay at the opposite end of the world from it. That landmass is called Antarctica. The name is built from the Greek prefix asterisk, anti-asterisk, meaning opposite, and that same old astronomer's word, asterisk, Arcticos, asterisk, meaning of the bear. So the southernmost continent on Earth carries a name that means precisely opposite the bear, a reference to a constellation that is invisible from Antarctica itself, a constellation that belongs entirely to the northern sky, to the world the ancient Greeks actually lived in and looked up from. The name of the most remote place on Earth is, in that quiet way, a message sent from somewhere else entirely, a label attached by people who had no idea the place existed, using a word that pointed in the opposite direction. The constellation Ursa Major is never visible from the Antarctic continent. The night sky at the southern pole shows entirely different stars, but the name that points north has been anchored to that southern place for as long as European languages have had a word for it, a compass needle frozen in the wrong direction, pressed into the ice by a word. There is a particular quality to names that outlast the understanding they were built from. The Greek astronomer in that open courtyard was doing something careful and precise, observing the sky, using language accurately to describe what he saw. The word asterisk, Arcticos, asterisk was correct for what it was naming in that moment. It was only later, when someone tried to name the opposite direction, that the astronomer's careful observation was carried to a place he had never been, pressed into service for a continent he could not have imagined, and frozen there in a name that will most likely last as long as the place is discussed at all. To look at the word Antarctica is to see, compressed into 8 syllables, the particular shape of human knowledge in a specific historical moment, the limits of a world that extended as far as the Mediterranean and its edges, the precision of Greek astronomical observation, and the long future that waited beyond the southern horizon, unnamed and unknown, until someone needed a word for it, and reached back to an old astronomer's name for the north. The Sierra Nevada sits on the western edge of North America, a long ridge of granite peaks running roughly 400 miles through what is now California. In winter and into spring, the peaks hold snow. On clear mornings, seen from the western valleys, the range rises white against the blue, the peaks sharp and pale and unmistakable. A Spanish expedition, moving through that landscape in the 18th century, looked east toward that ridge and reached for a word. The word they chose was asterisk. Nevada, asterisk. In Spanish, it means snow-covered, or more precisely, it is the past participle of asterisk, Nevada, asterisk, to snow, something that has been snowed upon, something wearing its snow. The name they gave to the mountain range was Sierra Nevada, the snowy range, the snow-covered ridge, the thing that has received the snow and holds it. The name was accurate. The name was a description. Standing in the right place on the right winter morning, looking east, the range earns its name completely. The state that now carries that name is another matter. Nevada, the state, not the mountains, is among the driest and most sun-beaten territories in the country. Large portions of it receive less than 10 inches of rain per year. The landscape that most people associate with the name Nevada is not mountain snow, but valley heat, the brown and sand-colored ranges of the Great Basin, the alkali flats shimmering in summer light, the open dry stretches between small towns that can run for 100 miles without a tree. The name that was given to snow-capped peaks has settled over the desert like a covering that does not quite fit. It is not that the name is wrong. The Sierra Nevada still stands where it always has, still holds its snow in winter, still earns the description that the Spanish expedition attached to it. But the word asterisk Nevada, asterisk snow-covered, is now the official name of a place where snow is an event, a surprise, a notable exception to the ordinary dry heat of the year. The name has traveled away from the thing it described. It got attached to an administrative boundary drawn for political reasons and carried inland past the mountains into country that the original name was never meant to hold. Names do that. They are placed on things by people in a specific moment, looking at a specific view, and then the name stays while the view changes, or while the thing that carries the name becomes associated with something entirely different. The Spanish travelers who looked at snow-bright peaks and said asterisk Nevada, asterisk, were being entirely accurate. They could not have known that the accuracy would eventually be stretched thin across 100,000 square miles of desert. Las Vegas sits in a broad valley surrounded by mountains on all sides. The valley floor in high summer is among the hottest places in North America. The city is famous for glass towers, electric light, artificial waterfalls, replicated landmarks, and the particular self-constructed quality of a place that has largely willed itself into existence. Very little about Las Vegas, as it currently stands, suggests that it was once described by the word it still carries. That word is asterisk Vegas, asterisk. In Spanish, it means fertile meadows, or grassy plains, or the kind of low ground near water where grass grows thick and green. The name was given not to the city that would eventually occupy this valley, but to the landscape itself, or more precisely, to a specific feature of it, the patches of spring-fed green that early travelers encountered when they stopped here. Underground springs pushed water upward through the valley floor in places, and where they did, grass grew. The horses could drink. The ground was soft and wet, and entirely unlike the dry miles that surrounded it. Someone looked at those green patches and spoke the word asterisk Vegas, asterisk, and the name stayed. The springs that fed those meadows are largely gone now, drawn down by the extraordinary demand of a city that uses water on a scale no 19th century traveler looking at wet grass could have considered. The green oasis that gave the place its name was a temporary thing, a geological accident, water surfacing briefly before continuing its slow movement through stone. The name asterisk Vegas, asterisk meadows, grassland, the green and wet now sits over one of the most thoroughly constructed environments on the continent, a place where the natural landscape has been so completely replaced that the word that named it describes something most visitors would not recognize as present. There is something that functions as a quiet joke in this, a city famous for artifice, carrying a name that means natural abundance, a desert settlement called the Meadows, a place built almost entirely from human effort, named for the effortless emergence of spring water through sand. The name is not wrong in any official sense. It was simply accurate once, and then the place changed, and the name remained, still pointing at the grass and the water long after both had mostly gone. The names of places carry the photographs of what those places used to look like. The photographs do not update. The landscape moves on beneath them, seasons and centuries passing, and the name stays where it was pinned, still pointing at a river that changed course, a forest that was cleared, a meadow where a hotel now stands. Dublin is a city of roughly 1 million people built on either side of the River Liffey as it approaches the sea. It has been inhabited in one form or another for a very long time. Settlement layers that go back past the Vikings, past the early medieval period, past the first groups of people who found the river a useful place and stayed near it. The city has two names, and neither one refers to the same geographical feature as the other. The name most people know, Dublin, comes from the Old Irish asterisk, Dublin asterisk, meaning the Black Pool. The Black Pool in question was a dark tidal pool formed at the place where a smaller river, the Poddle, flowed into the Liffey. The water there was dark, stained by the peat that the Poddle carried out of the boggy hinterland to the south and west. When the Vikings arrived in the 9th century and began to settle along the estuary, they heard the Irish name for that dark confluence and kept it. Their tongues reshaped it slightly, as tongues always do with borrowed words, but the meaning came through intact. The place was the Dark Pool, and Dark Pool it remained. The other name, the one that appears on official Irish government documents and road signs, is asterisk, Balathacliath, asterisk. It translates as the town of the ford of the hurdles. The Hurdle Ford was a different place entirely, a crossing point, further up the Liffey, shallow enough to cross on foot if the river was low, stabilized in ancient times by weaving branches and wicker into a kind of reinforced path through the water. Two entirely different features of the same waterway produced two entirely different names, and the city ended up carrying both, the Dark Pool on one set of signs and the Hurdle Ford on another, each name pointing at a different part of the same river in the same city, neither one quite containing the whole thing. The Poddle still runs under Dublin. It was buried beneath the city centuries ago, its course redirected through stone channels and culverts, covered over as the city grew above and across it. The dark pool it fed no longer exists as a visible thing, but the name asterisk Dublin asterisk Black Pool persisted long after the pool was covered, long after the Vikings who borrowed it had become simply the ancestors of people who no longer thought of themselves as Norse, long after the Liffey was embanked and bridged and its edges built over so thoroughly that the original confluence is now somewhere beneath a paved street. A name can outlast the thing that made it by many centuries. The Black Pool is gone. The Hurdle Ford is gone. The name for the Dark Pool is still on every letterhead, every map, every flight destination, every postcard. The name for the Ford of the Hurdles is still on every road sign entering the city from the motorway. Both names persist, each one pointing at a feature that has not been visible for a very long time. There is a particular patience in old place names. They hold their descriptions without insisting on them. They do not become confused when the thing they describe disappears, or changes, or gets built over. They simply continue, carrying their meaning lightly, waiting for someone to look closely enough to ask what the words actually say. What they say, in Dublin's case, is two different things. Here was a dark pool. Here was a place to cross. Both were true once. Both names are still in use. The river moves through the city in its stone-lined channel, and the names move through the language in their own slow way, carrying their photographs of old water and old crossings, unhurried. The Sahara covers roughly the same area as the continental United States. It stretches from the Atlantic coast of North Africa east to the Red Sea, from the Mediterranean south to a line of grassland and scrub that marks the edge of what different climate patterns produce. Across that enormous space, the names of individual features vary: ranges, depressions, wadis, plateaus, the separate names of separate parts. But the whole space, seen from a sufficient distance, needed a single word. The word was Sharha. It is Arabic, and it means desert, or wilderness, or simply the empty place, the place that is not agricultural, not settled, not the kind of ground that produces food or shelter in reliable ways. An Arab geographer writing in the medieval period might dip his pen and write Hara across a blank space on a map, one word stretched over an area larger than any other in the region, the word meaning simply this, all of this, the thing that is too large to be described feature by feature, and so must be named as a category. When European scholars and explorers encountered this word and the region it named, they did what people generally do when borrowing a word from another language alongside a translated equivalent. They used both. The Arabic Sharhar became the name of the place, Sahara, and the English word asterisk desert. Asterisk became its description. So the phrase that entered ordinary use was the Sahara Desert. The Sahara, the desert, the empty place, empty place. The Arabic descriptive word and the English translated word, sitting side by side in the same phrase, each one saying the same thing, neither one aware that the other was there. This kind of doubling has a name in linguistics. It is called a pleonasm, or sometimes a tautological place name, and it is more common than might be expected. Languages meet, words travel, translators do their work, and sometimes the translated version and the original version both stick, walking forward together into the future, the redundancy never quite becoming obvious enough to require correction. The doubling does no real harm. The Sahara Desert means exactly what everyone who uses it understands it to mean. The repetition is invisible in ordinary speech, the way that many things built into place names are invisible until someone pauses and looks at them directly. The word is just the word, the place is just the place. And yet sitting inside the phrase is a medieval Arabic geographer writing one word across a vast blank space, and a later European translator doing the same work twice without knowing it. The Sharha is a geographical category, not one specific place, but the condition of emptiness across an enormous space is a different kind of name from the ones that identify particular pools or passes or ranges. It is a name that describes a quality rather than a feature. It does not point at a ford or a peak or a confluence. It points at the whole character of a region and says, this is what this is. It is the kind of name that requires standing back far enough to see the whole thing at once before the word becomes useful. An Arab geographer doing that work in the medieval period had access to information about the region that European scholars of the same period did not. Arab trading networks, pilgrimage routes, and scholarly traditions had been moving across and through the Sahara for centuries by the time European cartographers were beginning to fill in the blank spaces on their own maps. The word Sharha was not an approximation made from ignorance. It was precise, and it has proven accurate enough to last. There is something quietly satisfying in the idea of a single syllable, or in this case, a single word of 3 syllables, doing the work of holding a space that large. Maps have limited room, names must be compact. And so across an area that a person could travel for months without crossing, there sits one word, written once, covering everything within the lines drawn around it, still meaning, in the Arabic it came from, exactly what it said when it was first pressed into ink. To look at a map and see the name of a place is, almost always, to look at the residue of a decision made by a specific person in a specific moment. Someone was standing somewhere, looking at something, and they needed a word for it. The word they chose reflected what they saw, what language they spoke, what features of the landscape mattered to them, what they were there to do. Then the word was written down or passed between people speaking, and it traveled forward without its original speaker, carrying a description of a moment that no longer exists into every moment that followed. The Greek astronomer's word for the bear stars pressed south to name a continent he never knew was there. The Spanish explorer's word for snow pressed inland to name a desert state. The word for meadows pressed over glass and light where the meadow used to be. The old Irish word for a dark pool pressed into a name that cities and governments still use, even though the pool has been covered by streets for centuries. The Arab geographer's word for emptiness pressed forward through languages until it sits doubled in an English phrase, saying the same thing twice. None of these people were trying to make something last. They were naming what was in front of them, doing the ordinary work of language, giving things handles so they could be discussed and remembered and found again. The lasting was accidental, the travel was accidental. The particular chain of translations and borrowings and administrative decisions that carried each word to the place it now occupies, none of that was planned. What survives in a place name is not usually what the person doing the naming thought was important. The Greek astronomer thought about the stars. What survived in Antarctica was the stars he named them for. The Spanish explorer thought about the mountains. What survived in Nevada was the snow on the mountains. The Viking navigator thought about the river confluence and the Irish name he heard for it. What survived in Dublin was the pool that the confluence made. The Arab geographer thought about the quality of the land. What survived in Sahara was that quality, doubled, the specific, the noticed, the named. These are what travel, a feature of a landscape, observed carefully enough to require a word, can carry that observation forward for 1,000 years or more into a future that the observer could not have imagined. The dark pool at the mouth of the Pottle will be noted as long as Dublin is mentioned. The snow on the peaks will be noted as long as Nevada is discussed. The bare stars of the northern sky will be noted as long as the southern continent has a name. This is what place names do, that ordinary memory cannot quite manage. Memory requires a rememberer, and rememberers are mortal. But a word pressed into a name, and that name pressed into maps, and those maps pressed into the languages of successive populations, a word can outlast the civilization that coined it, the language it was first spoken in, the people who had a reason to care about the particular feature it described. It can arrive in a century the coiner never imagined, in a mouth that speaks a language the coiner never heard, still carrying its description of a bear, or snow, or grass, or a dark pool, or empty space. There is no urgency in any of this. The names are not going anywhere. Antarctica will hold its Greek astronomer's observation about the north for as long as people write about the south. Nevada will hold its Spanish explorer's observation about mountain snow for as long as the state exists on a map. The names are patient. They have already demonstrated that they can wait centuries for someone to look at them closely. A few more hours, or years, or decades will not trouble them at all. The Viking navigator who murmured *Dublin, *dark pool to himself as his ship moved up, the Liffey was not naming a city. He was naming a patch of dark water. The city came much later, and it came for reasons that had nothing to do with what any particular navigator found poetic or memorable about the river. Cities grow for reasons of trade and defense and agriculture and accident, and the names that were already attached to the landscape get incorporated into the city's name almost without anyone deciding to do it. The pool was there. The pool had a name. The name was known. The city grew around the name, and the name became the city's name, and eventually the pool was covered, and the name was all that remained of the pool. Standing on O'Connell Street in Dublin, or on a platform in Euston Station, or on any of the bridges that cross the Liffey, there is no visible evidence of the dark pool. The Pottle's underground. The confluence is buried. The Viking settlement is under layers of medieval and Georgian and modern building. All of it is gone in the physical sense, replaced so thoroughly that no casual visitor would know to look for it. But the name that pointed at the pool is still pointing, still indicating a place and a feature, still saying *Dublin, *dark pool, in every mention of the city's name, every time anyone says Dublin, in any language, in any country, anywhere that the word has traveled to. This is the particular work that language does. It holds descriptions of things that no longer look the way they did when they were described. It keeps the observation alive after the thing observed has changed. It carries the moment forward, unhurried, into every moment that follows, asking for nothing, requiring no maintenance, simply continuing. The Spanish word Nevada, will describe those mountains long after the political boundary that borrowed the word as a historical note rather than a current fact. The Arabic Sredf will describe that emptiness long after the medieval geographer's map has turned to dust. The old Irish Dublin will describe that pool long after the last traces of the confluence have been dissolved by whatever comes after concrete. And the Greek Arcticos of the bear, belonging to the stars the Greeks saw turning in the northern sky, will name the bottom of the world for as long as there is a world with a bottom to name. The medieval Arab geographer who wrote Sahra across the blank space on his map was not thinking about how long the word would last. He was thinking about accuracy, about whether the word correctly described the region he was mapping. He was doing careful, considered work. The pen moved across the surface. The ink settled into the grain of the material. The word spread across an enormous space in small, precise letters, one word covering more ground than any traveler could cross in a season of walking. The map itself did not survive intact, and maps from that period rarely do. Copies were made, and copies of copies, and translations into other languages and other cartographic traditions, and each copy introduced small changes in the way the names were rendered, the way the word was spelled, the shape of the letters that carried the sound. But the word, the core of it, the sound and the sense traveled through all of those copies, through all of those translations, through centuries of cartographic tradition, until it arrived in European atlases as Sahara, sitting beside the English word desert, both of them pointing at the same enormous space, the same quality of land, the same observation that a medieval geographer made when he looked at his geographical information and reached for the most accurate word he had. The small letters of his careful inscription are long gone. The word remains. One word, written once, still covering all of that ground, still meaning what it meant the first time someone pressed it into ink, simply the empty place, the wide and open expanse, the space that goes on farther than a name usually needs to go. It is a small thing that a word can do, and a large one. Small, because a word is just a sound, just a pattern of letters, just a noise the throat makes and the tongue shapes. Large, because that noise, shaped right, can carry an observation across 2,000 years and deliver it intact, still pointing at its original object, still accurate to what someone saw and needed a word for in a specific moment that is now very far away. There are thousands of place names on every detailed map of the world, and most of them contain, somewhere inside them, an observation like this one, a description of weather, or water, or the shape of the land, or the animals that used to live there, or the people who passed through, or the plants that grew in a valley before it was cleared, or the color of a particular river at a particular time of year. Most of those observations go unread. The names are used without being examined, the way that sentences are spoken without anyone pausing to consider the roots of each word. The name is just the name. The place is just the place. But the description is there, pressed into the syllables, waiting in the letters, patient as the names themselves have learned to be over however many centuries they have been carrying their original moments forward through time. The word Shahra was pressed into ink across an enormous space on a medieval map, one small inscription covering an expanse of land larger than most regions that names are ever asked to cover. The ink has long since faded into whatever surface received it. The map has traveled through time in copies and translations, and the word has traveled with it, always pointing at the same space, always carrying the same description: the empty place, the wide land, the open reach of ground that goes on until geography itself becomes the horizon. One word, a very large space, both of them still here. A thin column of smoke rises from the island on a gray morning. It moves slowly, bending a little where the upper air catches it, and then straightening again, climbing until it disappears into the low cloud above the water. The Roman sailor standing at the prow of his vessel watches it with the steady, unsurprised attention of a man who has passed this way before. He knows what makes the smoke. He knows who is down there, far beneath the rock and the sea, working the bellows, striking the iron. The mountain does not frighten him. It is simply where a god lives, the way a god lives anywhere, in the place that already seems to belong to something larger than ordinary life. The island the sailor is watching is Volcano, a small volcanic outcrop off the northern coast of Sicily, and the god he believes inhabits it is Vulcan, the Roman deity of fire and metalworking. The Romans understood the heat rising from the island's summit and the low rumbling that could sometimes be felt through the hull of a passing ship as the evidence of a forge operating somewhere in the deep interior of the earth. Vulcan worked there, in their understanding, producing weapons and armor and tools for the other gods, a craftsman deity, not a war god, but a maker of the instruments that war required. The smoke above the island was his chimney. The trembling in the water was the rhythm of his hammer. That belief has long since faded from the cultures that once held it. The volcano remains, and what the Romans used for the island, and then gradually for any mountain that produced fire and smoke from its interior, has passed forward through more than 2,000 years of use until it sits in ordinary modern speech, neutral, geological, stripped of its divine occupant, volcano. The god's name, reshaped around the phenomenon he was once believed to cause. It is a quiet kind of persistence. The deity himself is gone, at least from the register of active belief, but the structure of the word he lent his name to remains intact. Every time someone uses the word volcano in a news report about an eruption in Iceland, in a classroom lesson about tectonic plates, in the casual mention of a documentary half-watched on a Tuesday evening, the name of a Roman smith god passes through their mouth without their awareness of it, moves through the air, and disappears. This is how mythology survives in language, not as active belief, not as story told deliberately, but as residue, a shape that meaning once occupied, still holding its outline. The island of Volcano is still there. It still produces its thin column of smoke. Ships still pass it. The smoke still rises and bends where the upper air catches it. What has changed is only the explanation attached to it. The story the smoke is embedded in has shifted, and the god has stepped back from the foreground until he is nearly invisible. Nearly, but not quite. Not while the word is still in use. Ceres is another figure who stepped back but did not disappear. She was the Roman goddess of agriculture and grain, one of the older and more settled presences in the Roman religious imagination. Not a dramatic figure, not a deity of storms or battles or the underworld, but the one whose domain was the slow, reliable, annual return of crops from the earth. Her name was so thoroughly bound to the idea of grain that the Latin language did not bother to invent a separate adjective for grain-related things. It simply borrowed from her name, producing asterisk cerealis, asterisk meaning of or pertaining to grain, pertaining to Ceres, pertaining to what she oversees. In the Latin of Roman agricultural and religious writing, the fields of grain in summer were her fields. The harvest festival was her festival. The bread on the table was, in a sense that was neither purely metaphorical nor purely literal, her gift. The word moved through this religious and domestic landscape for centuries, and then continued moving after the religious context had thinned considerably, until it arrived in English as cereal, a grain-based food, a breakfast staple, a word used on product packaging and in the aisles of ordinary shops, carrying a goddess inside it, whose existence most of the people using the word are entirely unaware of. Ceres does not require awareness to persist. That is the interesting thing. Spielon one, the word does not need anyone to believe in her, remember her, or even know her name. The etymology does the work of preservation without asking anything from the speaker. She is in the word regardless of whether anyone thinks of her while reaching for the box. What makes her case distinct from Vulcan's is the quality of what she represented. Vulcan was explained by a dramatic natural phenomenon, fire coming from a mountain, heat and noise and visible force. His presence in the word volcano makes a certain narrative sense even after the belief has faded, because the phenomenon itself retains its drama. Cereal is a quieter inheritance. The word names a category of food so mundane, so ordinary, so domestically unremarkable that finding a goddess inside it requires a genuine pause. The most everyday things at the breakfast table turn out to be named for a deity whose name was once spoken in temples, in fields at harvest time, in the prayers said before the first cut of the reaping blade. There is a kind of symmetry in that. The word for something consumed every morning by millions of people in ordinary kitchens contains within it one of the oldest human gestures, the acknowledgement that the grain in the earth requires something beyond human effort to return. The goddess no longer needs to be named for that acknowledgement, to sit quietly in the language. Janus is a figure who requires more effort to find in daily life, though his name comes around reliably once a year. He is the Roman god of beginnings, but more specifically the god of thresholds, doorways, transitions, and the passage from one state to another. The Romans depicted him with two faces set back to back on a single head, one looking forward and one looking behind. He could see what had passed and what was coming simultaneously. He stood at the hinge between things. The Romans did not build his temple in the form most people would expect a temple to take. It was less a place of worship and more a kind of architectural portal, a roofed gateway with two great wooden doors, one at each end, and a threshold between them. The doors of this gateway were kept open during wartime, During the rare periods when Rome was not engaged in any active conflict, the doors were closed. The closure was significant enough to be recorded as an event. War was Rome's default condition for most of its history, and so the open doors of Janus's gateway were in practice nearly always open, the threshold perpetually in the state of passage, never fully arrived. His name attached itself to January when the Roman calendar was restructured, because January is the month at the threshold of the year, the doorway between the one that has ended and the one that is beginning. The naming is exact. The god of hinges and transitions stands at the hinge of the calendar, looking in both directions at once. Every time the month is named, the two-faced figure is there at the edge of it, watching the year come and go. The temple gateway is gone. The calendar remains, and January with it, and the two faces looking forward and backward persist in the name without announcement, the way a fossil persists in a layer of rock that no one has opened yet. Most people pass through January with nothing more than the mild awareness of a new year beginning. The god at the threshold is content with that, or would be, if gods required anything from the people who had named a month after them. What the January example makes plain is how thoroughly the structure of the Roman religious calendar has been absorbed into the framework of how the weeks and months are counted in English, a language that arrived in Britain long after Rome, that was spoken by people who did not pray to Roman gods, and that has carried the gods along regardless. The names of the days and months, the deep calendar structure of English, is in significant part a Roman inheritance, and the gods are embedded in it so seamlessly that the question of whether anyone believes in them has become irrelevant. They are in the scaffolding. The scaffolding holds the language up. The threshold Janus watches is still there. It opens at the end of each December and closes without ceremony as February begins. He stands there, as he always stood there, at the hinge of things, looking both ways, the doors of his gateway open. The ocean is older than any Roman god. The ancient Greek imagination understood this, which is why the figure they placed at the origin of all waters was not an Olympian deity, not one of the younger generation of gods who presided over recognizable human concerns like love or war or wisdom, but a Titan, one of the older and more fundamental beings who predated the Olympians and represented the deep structures of the world itself. Oceanus was his name, and he was not simply a personification of the sea in the way that Poseidon was. He was something more foundational. He was the river that encircled the entire world. The ancient Greeks understood the earth as a flat disk, and Oceanus was the great river running around its outer edge, not a still body of water, but a moving current, always flowing, the thing that contained everything else. The rivers inside the world, all the rivers, every one of them, were understood to come from Oceanus, to draw their water from him. The freshwater springs that rose from underground were his water finding its way up through the rock. He was less a creature and more a mechanism, the hydraulic principle underlying all of the world's water, given a body and a name. When the word that came from his name passed into English, it had already traveled considerably through Latin, through the navigational vocabulary of Mediterranean seafarers, through the expanding consciousness of people learning that the water beyond the edge of the known world was not the encircling river they had imagined, but something unimaginably larger and more various. The ocean they eventually named was not Oceanus. The ocean turned out to be an entirely different kind of thing, a vast body of open water between continents, measurable in degrees of latitude and longitude, subject to scientific description, to mapping and charting and depth sounding. The Titan was replaced by an atlas, but the name he left behind stayed attached to the water, the way a name often stays attached to a place after the person who first named it has been entirely forgotten. Ocean. 4 letters borrowed from a being who was believed to hold all the world's rivers in his body, now used for the Atlantic and Pacific and Indian and Arctic and Southern, named in atlases and weather reports and geography lessons. The Titan entirely absent from the word as it is used and entirely present in the origin of it. There is something in that shift worth sitting with. The scale of it, the translation of what the word meant to the people who first used it into what it means to the people who use it now. To the ancient Greeks, Oceanus was the boundary of the world. To anyone navigating the North Atlantic in a container ship or looking at a satellite image of the Pacific from above, the ocean is emphatically not the edge of anything. It is the middle. The world turns out to be rounder and stranger and more continuous than the original word holder imagined. And yet the word he gave held. It held for 2,500 years. It is holding still. The fading of Oceanus from active belief into linguistic residue is perhaps the most gradual of the mythological retreats embedded in everyday language, simply because of the sheer time involved. The Greek Titans belong to one of the oldest surviving bodies of religious cosmology in the Western tradition. Oceanus was imagined before the great Athenian playwrights, before Socrates, before Alexander, before the entire span of the Roman Empire, before Christianity, before any of the political entities that currently map the coastlines of the seas that still carry his name. He has been receding from belief for a very long time, and the word he left behind has shown no inclination to follow him. What it means to look at the ocean, then to stand at a coast, or to watch it from above, or simply to use the word in ordinary speech, is to rest on top of something that old. Not the water, which is older still, but the name. The name has its own antiquity, separate from the waters, and it persists in the language, the way a smooth stone persists on a riverbed, long after anyone placed it there. There is a hillside somewhere in the Greek world where the story of Echo is set. Rocky, dry, scattered with low plants, the kind of slope where sound travels oddly in the late afternoon when the air cools and the shadows begin to lengthen. The myth is one of the older ones, and like many of the older myths, it begins not with a dramatic act of creation or destruction, but with a much smaller human quality, the desire to talk. Echo was a nymph, one of the lesser divine figures who populated springs and forests and mountain slopes in the Greek imagination, not Olympian, but not mortal, something in between. Her particular quality was speech. She talked. At length, with pleasure, she talked. And the talk was not idle. It served a purpose in at least one version of the story. She kept Hera, the wife of Zeus, occupied with conversation, while Zeus pursued interests elsewhere. The talking was a deliberate distraction, deployed with skill. When Hera understood what had been happening, the punishment she chose was precise. She took from Echo what Echo had used against her, the free use of her own voice. Echo was left able to produce sound, but not original sound. She could only repeat what she had just heard. The last words of whatever was spoken to her came back in her mouth, accurate and immediate, and nothing else. She could not initiate. She could not respond with her own thoughts. She could only return to the speaker the tail end of what they had just said, like water finding its way back to its starting level. The story does not end there. Echo fell in love with Narcissus, a figure who has his own word embedded in him, though that word belongs to a different domain. She could not tell him. She could only wait for him to speak and then return his words to him, which was not enough. and he did not stay, and she declined from that point, not in the way that mortals decline, but slowly, insubstantially, thinning until she was no longer visible, no longer present in any form that occupied space. What remained was only the sound, the voice with no body behind it, repeating what it heard. The Greeks named the acoustic phenomenon after her. When sound bounces back from a hard surface, from the face of a cliff, from the wall of a valley, from the interior of a large cave, and arrives back at the ear as a repetition of what was just spoken, that return of sound carries her name. Echo. The word was already a myth before it was a physics term. The physics term happened to describe exactly what the myth described. A voice that can only repeat, that contains no original content of its own, that offers back to the speaker the last part of what was just said and then falls silent. The precision of that alignment between the punishment in the story and the acoustic behavior named after the figure who received it is unusual even among etymologies with mythological origins. Most mythological word origins work by association. A god is associated with a phenomenon, and the phenomenon takes the god's name. The connection is one of ownership or resemblance. Echo is different. The punishment defined the behavior, and the behavior became the name. What Hera took from the nymph is exactly what the word describes. The voice that can only repeat, the sound that gives back what it receives. She is in every echo then, every voice that comes back from a wall or a hillside or the far end of a tunnel carries her inside it, not as a ghost, not as a supernatural presence, but as etymology, as origin, as the story the word was made from before anyone thought to measure the speed of sound or describe the mechanics of reflection. The behavior was understood as a punishment before it was understood as a physical property. That understanding left its mark. It is worth staying on that hillside a little longer in the cooling late afternoon, with the shadows beginning to deepen and the sound moving oddly in the shifting air. Someone has called out a name toward the rocky slope. The name arrives at the stone and comes back. Not the whole name, just the end of it, the final syllable, returning at a slight delay, accurate and empty, containing the sound but not the intention. The person who called stands still. The return of the sound is not an answer. It never is. It is only the last part of what was said, given back. That is what the word holds. Not the whole myth, not the full story of the nymph and the god's wife, and the particular vanity of the young man she could not reach. Just that one quality, that one behavior, extracted from the story and attached to the phenomenon it perfectly described. The punishment made visible in the acoustics of the physical world. The shape of what was taken, held forever in the name. What connects Vulcan and Ceres and Janus and Oceanus and Echo is not that they are particularly obscure or particularly famous. Some are central figures in ancient mythology, and some are peripheral. What they share is something simpler. The words they left behind have outlasted them by orders of magnitude. The gods have retired from active belief. The Titan has been displaced by cartography. The nymph has thinned to nothing. The words persist. This is what language does with the things that pass through it. It does not preserve the full shape of a belief or a story or a cosmology. It preserves fragments, one concept, one quality, one phenomenon, and carries that fragment forward without necessarily carrying the rest. The Roman who burned offerings to Vulcan understood the word volcano as part of an active religious framework. The geologist who uses the same word today understands it as part of a system of physical processes. The word bridges both. It is the same word, and it is doing entirely different work in each mouth. and somewhere in its history it crossed a threshold, probably very gradually, where the religious meaning receded and the geological meaning advanced, and the crossing was so slow that no one noticed it happening. The gods in these words were not banished. They were not defeated or disproven in any single event. They simply became less necessary to the explanation, and the words they had given to phenomena remained, usable for new purposes, carrying their origins quietly and without insistence. There is a kind of deep patience in that process, though patience is not exactly the right word for something that happens without a subject, doing the waiting. The words have no intentions. They do not wait. They simply exist in the mouths of successive generations, doing whatever work the speakers require of them, holding their original contents without emphasis, available to anyone who cares to look, but demanding nothing of those who do not. Vulcan has been in the word volcano for long enough that his name has passed through languages he never belonged to, into Spanish, into French, into English, into Japanese, into Hindi, into hundreds of languages spoken by people who inherited the scientific vocabulary of European geology and the word it used for fire mountains. He travels in those mouths now, present and absent at once, a Roman deity moving through linguistic families he has no other connection to, because the word the Romans gave a natural phenomenon stuck and spread and kept spreading. Ceres follows the same path. She sits in cereal boxes in shops in Seoul and Sao Paulo and Stockholm, in languages that would have been entirely foreign to any Roman who worshipped her, her name absorbed into a category of food products that would have been unrecognizable in the world where her temple stood. The grain is still grain. The name is still her name. The connection between them is 2,000 years old and currently printed in type on the side of a cardboard box next to a nutritional information panel. Janus stands at the door of January, everywhere that the Gregorian calendar is in use, which is to say nearly everywhere. His threshold is an international one now, a global hinge between years, and the two faces that the Romans carved on coins and temple reliefs have left no image in the modern imagination of the month, only the name, the slight curve of it, the soft beginning, and the closed ending, January, the god hidden inside a month that belongs to the whole world. Oceanus runs under every use of the word ocean in every language that borrowed the word from the Greek and Latin tradition, which is, again, a very large number of languages, because the scientific and navigational vocabulary of European seafaring carried the word outward with it, embedding a Greek titan in the naming systems of cultures that had their own names and their own stories for the water. He coexists now with those other names, the Titan and the indigenous and the vernacular, the old Greek boundary of the world, sitting alongside every other name the ocean has ever been given. And echo comes back from every reflecting surface that ever returned a sound, from cliff faces and valley walls and the tiled interiors of bathrooms and the concrete underpasses of cities, from canyon walls and landscapes the ancient Greeks never imagined, from the interior of stadiums and concert halls, where the behavior she was named for has been measured and calculated and corrected for in the design of the architecture. She comes back from all of them, from every hard surface that sends a sound back to the ear that made it. The last part of what was said, no more and no less. The hillside where the story was set is quiet now. The afternoon light has shifted. The shadows are longer. The person who called out has waited for the return of the sound and received it and turned to go. The name of a nymph who was punished by losing her own words hangs in the cooling air for a moment, just the last part of it, the tail end, bouncing back from the stone, and then it disappears into the silence of the hillside, the way it always does, the way it always has, for as long as there have been hard surfaces and sound to reach them, and people to stand still in the quiet afterward and take in what came back. In a bare room, on a clay surface still warm from the afternoon sun, a mathematician drew a small open circle. It was not a letter. It was not a number in any sense the people around him would have recognized. It was a mark for the absence of a thing, a way of writing down nothing, which is a harder problem than it sounds, because nothing does not announce itself the way something does. The circle sat on the clay surface, slightly oval where the stylus had turned, its interior smooth and empty. The room around it was quiet. Outside, the light was long and low and yellow. The mathematician looked at what he had made and understood it to mean that a column of counted things had come to zero, that the reckoning was complete, that there was nothing left to place in that position, and that this fact was worth marking rather than leaving blank. The Sanskrit word for what that circle meant was shunya. It translated roughly as empty. The mark was a way of making emptiness visible, of insisting that the space where a quantity was not deserved as much attention as the space where a quantity was. This was not a small idea. It took centuries for it to travel far enough to be understood as the foundational concept it turned out to be. The word shunya moved from the mathematical texts of ancient India into the Arabic shifra, which meant nothing, or cipher, a word that still exists in English today as a term for a kind of coded writing. From Arabic, the word passed into Latin as asterisk, zephyrum asterisk, a Latinization so approximate that the word barely resembles its origin, and from Latin into the Italian asterisk zero asterisk, where it contracted to the shape that eventually entered English. The journey took roughly 1,000 years. By the time the word arrived in the mouths of European merchants and scholars, the small open circle it named had already transformed how human beings were able to think about quantity, position, and the structure of number itself. None of that was visible in the word. The word was smooth and compact and gave no indication of the distance it had traveled, or the depth of the idea it carried, or the quiet room in which a man had drawn an oval on warm clay and described it as emptiness. That is the nature of these words. We arrive in an ordinary mouth with no obvious sign of what they once were. It comes from the Latin asterisk, tri asterisk, meaning three, and asterisk angulus asterisk, meaning corner, so a triangle is simply a three-cornered thing, which it is, and which anyone who has ever seen one could have worked out without knowing the Latin. They tend to move with the things they name, arriving only when the named thing arrives, and disappearing or changing when the thing changes or goes away. The color orange did not exist in English as a word until the fruit arrived. This is not quite the same as saying the color did not exist. The color was visible in sunsets and autumn leaves and the coats of certain foxes, but the English language had no single word for it. The color was described as a shade of red, or as a kind of yellow, or as a variation of saffron, which was itself a borrowed word from a plant-based dye. Orange, as a distinct named color, came with the orange, and the orange came from somewhere else. The fruit's name began in Sanskrit as naranga, a word that appears to derive from older roots, and from Sanskrit it passed into Persian, where it became narang, and from Persian into Arabic, where it was naranj, and from Arabic into Old French, where it was asterisk, orange asterisk, and from Old French into English, where the leading sound gradually shifted over time until the fruit was simply an orange. At each stage the word was a borrowing, a sound copied from one mouth into another, across a trade route, or a border, or a translation. The fruit traveled with its name, and the name arrived before the color did. By the time the English language needed a word for the particular shade that fell between red and yellow on an autumn afternoon, the fruit had been at the market long enough that its name was available for the purpose. For a while then, the color that now seems completely obvious, the color of a traffic cone, of a flame, of an October sky, was a shade that English speakers perceived but could not name with a single word. This is not evidence of any limitation in the people. Every language contains gaps where a distinction one culture makes precisely another culture leaves unnamed, because the things that make a distinction necessary have not yet arrived. The English gap in color vocabulary was simply the gap left by a fruit that had not yet crossed enough oceans. When the fruit arrived, the word came with it, and the gap closed, and the color became speakable. In a medieval English market, in autumn, a merchant might have received the first shipment and stood with the bright round fruit in his hand, turning it in the flat northern light, and reached for a word that did not quite fit. He might have said it was like saffron, or like a very ripe plum, or like the color that a sunset sometimes goes when there is cloud on the horizon. He would not have been wrong. He simply would not yet have had the word that made all those comparisons unnecessary. The word ruby moves differently. It does not carry a fruit or a mathematical idea or a practice in a field. It carries a color, and through that color connects a ring in a jeweler's case to a heading in a medieval manuscript, to a childhood illness, to the old red earth of certain landscapes, all through the same Latin root. The Latin asterisk rubeus asterisk meant red. From it came asterisk rubor, asterisk meaning redness, and from asterisk rubor asterisk came a cluster of English words that spread through different fields while keeping their root color. Ruby, the gemstone, takes its name from the redness of its particular shade of corundum, a deep, saturated red that the Romans found arresting enough to name after the color itself. Rubric, in its original meaning, referred to the red ink that medieval monks and scribes used to write headings, section markers, and important annotations in manuscripts. The text of a document might be written in black, but the titles and the guidance were written in red, the color that stood for emphasis, for direction, for the marking of a boundary between one thing and the next. A rubric was a red mark, a red title, a red instruction, and over time the word extended from the ink to the instruction itself until the color dropped away and a rubric became simply a set of guidelines with no red ink required. Rubella, the disease, was named in the 19th century for the red rash that accompanies it, a smaller, lighter redness than the scarlet of more serious fevers, but red enough to carry the Latin root. The name was a Latinization of what the eye observed, the same method that doctors had used for centuries to name conditions by their most visible characteristic. In this case, the visible characteristic was a color, and the color was the same color as the gemstone and the manuscript ink and the old adjective, all of them reaching back to asterisk rubeus asterisk, all of them still faintly red, if held up to the light in the right way. The same root is buried, slightly further down, in the English word rouge, which came through French, rather than directly from Latin, but carries the same redness, and in rust, which is the redness of iron, giving itself back to the air, and in robin, which in some older uses described the bird by the color on its chest. Red is one of the oldest color categories in human language. Languages that have words for only two colors tend to divide the spectrum into dark and light, and languages that have words for three typically add red, third, before any other color gets its own name. The redness in asterisk rubeus asterisk is ancient, and the words it scattered into English are scattered widely enough that they no longer look like a family at first glance. But the monk reaching for his pot of red ink, and the jeweler turning a dark red stone in the light, and the physician noting the reddish tint of a rash, are all using words that share the same root, the same color, the same moment in Latin, when asterisk rubeus asterisk was simply a description of what the eye saw. The word calculate is the last of these, and in some ways the most grounded, physically, literally, concretely grounded, because its origin is a small, smooth stone. The Latin word asterisk, calculus, asterisk meant pebble or small stone. It referred specifically to the kind of small, rounded stones that are common near riverbeds, water-worn, smooth in the hand, the kind of stone a person might gather by the handful without any particular effort. In Roman counting rooms and tax offices and market stalls, this kind of stone served a specific practical purpose. A grooved wooden counting board, a device known as an abacus in various forms throughout the ancient world, was laid flat on a table, and the grooves in the board represented different values: ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. A pebble placed in the ones groove stood for a single unit. A pebble moved from the ones groove to the tens groove stood for 10. By shifting stones from position to position, a Roman accountant could add, subtract, and track running totals with speed and accuracy. The physical movement of the stones standing in for the abstract movement of the numbers. The word for what he was doing was asterisk calculare, asterisk derived from asterisk calculus, asterisk meaning to move pebbles, or to use the pebbles for reckoning. From asterisk calculare, asterisk came the English asterisk calculate, asterisk which now describes any careful numerical process, from simple addition to the most complex operations in applied mathematics. The pebbles themselves vanished from the practice long ago. They were replaced by written notation, then by mechanical devices, then by electronic ones, but the word for the activity remained, and it remained in the shape of pebbles. There is something particular about this when a physicist describes a calculation that runs to hundreds of pages, or when a computer performs 1,000,000,000 operations per second. The word being used for that activity still has the shape of a Roman tax collector, bending over a grooved wooden board and moving small stones from one position to another with his finger. The scale is incomparably different, the abstraction is incomparably greater, but the word connecting the modern practice to the ancient one has not changed and has not lost its pebbles, even though no one in the room can see them. Isaac Newton worked on what he called the method of fluxions, a way of describing how quantities change, at roughly the same time that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, working separately and reaching the same mathematical territory by a different path, or sequel, named his own version of the method, asterisk calculus, asterisk. Leibniz chose the Latin word deliberately, with its sense of reckoning, of systematic counting, of moving things from place to place in a careful order. The name stuck, the highest branch of mathematics that most students encounter, the one dealing with rates of change and the areas under curves and the behavior of quantities as they approach limits, that mathematics is named in the mouths of students and professors and engineers, after the small smooth stones that Roman accountants moved across grooved wooden boards in stone-floored rooms. A name as large as that, carrying a practice as vast as that, traced back to a pebble. This is how words tend to work. The grandest abstractions sit on the most ordinary foundations, and the foundations are usually physical, usually simple, usually something that could be held in a hand, or seen at a distance, or felt underfoot. The words that describe number and color and shape share this quality. They were made from the world as it was directly experienced, At a moment when someone needed a word for a thing and reached for the most immediate physical description available. Shunya was emptiness you could see in the space where a counted thing was not. Asterisk, geometron asterisk, was the act of measuring the earth with actual measuring tools. Asterisk, rubeus asterisk, was the particular redness visible to the eye in a stone, in a dye, in a rash. Asterisk calculus. Asterisk was a pebble small enough to move with one finger. These were not poetic choices or philosophical ones. They were practical ones. The people who made them were looking at things in front of them and naming what they saw. The abstraction came later. It always comes later. First, there is the stone, and the dye, and the rope in the mud, and the mark on the clay. Then the stone becomes a mathematical system, the dye becomes a category of gemstone, and disease and manuscript practice. The rope becomes the geometry of curved space. The mark becomes the foundation of modern number theory. The words hold the before and the after together, invisibly, in the same syllables. Consider the Sanskrit mathematician's room again for a moment. The sun has shifted. The light is no longer falling across the clay surface from the angle it was. The shadow in the interior of the small oval mark has deepened slightly, making the circle more visible, more clearly defined. The mathematician has moved on to the next problem, the next column, the next reckoning. The mark he left sits on the surface in the growing quiet of the late afternoon, a small open shape that means nothing is here, and which will eventually become, after a journey of 1,000 years through a dozen languages and as many cultures, the numeral on which every position in every number system that followed now depends. He did not know this. He could not have. He was doing arithmetic in a warm room, and he needed a mark for the absence of a quantity, and he drew the mark that seemed right and called it shunya, which meant empty, which was accurate, which was enough. The Egyptian surveyors also did not know the distance their rope would travel. They were standing in wet mud, re-establishing the corner of a field that the Nile had erased, stretching the knotted rope taut across the soft ground, and marking a position with a stake. The field next to theirs was also being remeasured. Someone further down the bank was calling out measurements. The river was low and brown and moving steadily past, indifferent. The work was ordinary and seasonal, and the people doing it were not thinking about the name it would leave in the vocabulary of mathematics. They were thinking about whether the corner was in the right place. The monk in the scriptorium was thinking about the chapter heading. The color of the ink mattered. Red stood for importance, stood for division, stood for the boundary between one section and the next, but the chemical properties of the pigment and its Latin name and its geological origin in a class of corundum crystals were not in his mind. He dipped the pen, he wrote the heading. The red mark on the vellum was for the reader, and the reader would know what it meant, because red marks had been used for emphasis long enough that the meaning had become conventional. He moved on to the next heading. The Roman tax collector in his stone-floored room was at the end of a long day. The columns had been gone through twice. The pebbles had been moved and counted and moved again, and the final totals had been marked into the wax tablet that would carry them to the next office. He gathered the pebbles from the board, small, rounded, water-worn, smooth in the palm, and returned them to the bowl that sat on the shelf beside the window. The sound of the pebbles settling against each other was small and quiet, a brief clatter that disappeared into the general silence of a room at the close of a working day. He set the counting board aside. The window opposite showed a gray late-afternoon sky. These are the rooms where the words were made. Not grand rooms, usually. Not famous moments. The mathematician's room was bare and warm. The surveyor's field was wet and ordinary. The monk's scriptorium was lit by a candle that smelled of tallow. The tax collector's counting room was stone-floored and cool and used every day for the same purpose. In each of these rooms, someone was doing something practical with an immediate physical object: a clay surface, a knotted rope, a pot of red ink, a handful of smooth stones. And the word for what they were doing accumulated and traveled and changed shape and arrived centuries or millennia later in a different context entirely, with all of its physical origins compressed invisibly inside it. Zero still holds the emptiness of shunya. Geometry still holds the knotted rope and the mud. Rubric still holds the red ink in the small clay pot. Calculate still holds the pebble in the bowl on the shelf. The words that describe the most abstract operations of the human mind: counting, measuring, naming a color, performing the calculus of rates of change across infinitely small intervals. These words were all at their root words for ordinary physical actions and objects. Someone moving a stone, someone measuring a field, someone writing in red, someone drawing a circle on clay. The abstractions grew tall from small concrete beginnings, and the beginnings are still there, quiet and specific, at the base of every long word. This is something that happens more broadly across the vocabulary of any language. The most technical and abstract words, when traced back far enough, almost always resolve into something simple and physical. The word asterisk, spirit, asterisk, was once a word for breath. The word asterisk, calculate. Asterisk was once a word for a pebble. The word asterisk, geometry. Asterisk was once a word for a practice involving ropes and mud and river floods. The abstraction is something that happened over time, through use, through the slow expansion of a word's meaning, as it was carried from one context to another by people who found it useful and adapted it to the new purpose without changing its shape. The shape changes slowly, over centuries, through the accumulated pressure of many mouths. A Sanskrit mathematical term moves through Arabic scholarship and Latin translation, and Italian merchant usage, and English adoption, and loses sounds, and gains sounds, and contracts, and re-expands and arrives, at last as zero. The physical object at the origin of asterisk calculus, asterisk, the pebble in the bowl, is no longer visible in the word, any more than the surveyor's rope is visible in the word asterisk geometry. Asterisk, or the red ink, is visible in the word asterisk, rubric, asterisk, but they are there, inside the words, in the way that the shape of an original object is preserved in the mold made from it. The mold does not look like the object, but the object determined the mold's shape, and everything cast from the mold carries that shape forward. The counting room is quiet now. The tax collector has gone. The bowl of pebbles sits on the shelf in the evening light, each stone smooth and ordinary, a small weight of rounded stone, worn by water over a long time. Nothing about the stones announces their history. Nothing about them suggests that the word for what was done with them would one day name the highest branch of mathematics. They are simply pebbles, the kind that could be gathered by the handful from any riverbed, small and cool and slightly rough where the water smoothing was incomplete, settling into each other in the bowl with the quiet, indifferent ease of things that have no idea they are significant. The window opposite has gone dark. The working day is over. Somewhere in the building, other sounds are resolving into silence, voices, footsteps, the closing of a heavy door. The grooved wooden board leans against the wall. The wax tablet with the final figures has been carried away. The only things remaining are the bowl of pebbles, the empty board, and the particular quality of silence that follows a long day's reckoning, when all the moving is done and the stones have settled into their final positions and nothing needs to be shifted anymore. The word that grew from those stones has traveled very far from this room. It has passed through Latin and through medieval European scholarship and through the notation systems of early modern mathematics and into the mouths of students in lit rooms all over the world, where it names a discipline of extraordinary abstraction and precision,